Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us in what is something of a first for ADD, a virtual public meeting. We have hundreds of people taking part. I'm Kate Beale-Blythe, a member of the ADD committee, and just so you know, during the webinar, you will automatically be on mute, so we can't hear you and we can't hear what you're saying at home. I would like to just put an apology in if there are any technical errors. I'm a little bit of a Zoom amateur, but we're trying our best. So we're here to discuss Eastleigh's local plan, and especially whether options B and C and the associated link road are truly dead and buried, or might they re-emerge at some later stage, and if so, what can we do about it? The format of today is that I will put your questions to two key people in ADD's fight against the local plan, our chair, John Lawrise, and Caroline Dibden, who is Deputy Chair of Hampshire CPRE. CPRE is, of course, the countryside charity. Thank you very much to those who sent in many questions, and many of them really excellent. Sadly, there may not be time for all of them, but as we're aiming to finish by 8:30, but if you also have something you're dying to ask, please type it in the box found at the bottom of the screen. There's a box that says Q&A. And I will then see all the questions and we'll try and fit in as many of those as possible too. Now, we're dividing this evening into 5 sections. First, what did the inspector actually say? Secondly, what was the council's reaction and what does that mean for ADD and our supporters? Thirdly, as well as opposing options B and C, do we have any constructive ideas to address Eastleigh's housing needs? Fourthly, what happens next? And finally, what can be done to help the cause? So, opening with some good news. But first, John, our outcome was a fantastic result. Would you like to say a few words to our supporters?
It absolutely was, Kate. I mean, there were so many people that didn't believe we could win. I mean, it was, many people talked about David and Goliath. I have to say it's an outstanding result. It's not unheard of, but it's quite unusual for an action group to be able to overturn a local part of it, significant part of a local plan. And we couldn't have done that without the support of thousands of people, literally thousands of people who felt this was the wrong plan, backed up also by 10 of the parish councils in the area, by so many organizations, CPRE of course, but the Hampshire Wildlife Trust, the Angling Trust, Friends of the Earth, and so on, the Woodland Trust, one could go on. And it was all of these organizations working together and all of them recognizing the flaws in Eastleigh's plan. So it's a fantastic result and we need to just enjoy that. And also, I'd like to thank the many, many people that worked so hard to make it all happen.
And that's great. And I think it's worth saying, and just to be clear about one thing, because I've been on the ADD committee since the start, and we really did not want to have to fight the council. We know that Eastleigh needs more housing, and it's always been our wish to work with the council rather than fight against it. Is that true, John?
Yeah, I mean, we were really disappointed at the beginning because they started off with a consultation paper called Issues and Options, which came out in December 2015. And they laid out the alternatives for delivering the housing that Eastleigh required, and they asked people to respond. And over 500 people said that options B and C were the wrong thing, and only about 10 said that it was the right thing. And Eastleigh went on just to ignore that, and they've consistently failed to take account of what people think. They've had no dialogue, at least at member level, with ADD, and we had early meetings with the planning officers, but even those they discontinued after a certain time. So we've been always trying to influence things without having to be difficult or aggressive. We want to be positive, and as you say, we want to see Eastleigh deliver the housing it requires.
And Caroline, thank you for all the support that CPRE and you personally have given ADD over the years. And CPRE had limited resources, yet you've been incredibly active in opposing Eastleigh local plan. What is it that makes this plan stick out from all the other developments that you could be fighting?
Well, as you say, we're a small charity, we're all volunteers, so we put in our time for the benefit of the countryside for everybody to enjoy. And that's really why we got involved in Eastleigh, because this is an exceptionally beautiful piece of Eastleigh's countryside. And we were completely staggered when this made it through to be the preferred option. Against all alternative sites which might have been considered, this is not only the most beautiful area of Eastleigh, it's always also the furthest from any public transport. It's the nearest to the South Downs National Park. It's the nearest to the River Itchen SAC, an important conservation area. So in the first instance, we were completely staggered, as I said, that it made it through to be the preferred option. And that's really when CPRE got involved. And we've continued to be involved throughout the process, sitting alongside Add all of the way, all of the journey. And we are equally thrilled with this result. It's a common sense result with the inspector seeing through all the flaws that were fundamental to this plan.
Thank you, Caroline. And I just wanted to welcome, because I can see how many people are joining, and more people are joining every minute. So I just want to welcome everybody to the webinar. And we've got people from the Borough of Eastleigh, but also many parts of the Winchester and the Winchester parishes. So welcome all. And just a reminder that you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I'm just going to say one comment that's come through the Q&A box, which is a lovely one to start with, is from Jenny Sutton. And she says, we firstly want to say thanks to an amazing result so far. So that's a really nice comment. Thank you very much. And I'll come to another one. So moving on to theme 1, which is the inspector's letter. John, we know that in headline terms, the planning inspector has asked the council to delete options B and C and the link road from the local plan. But there's more to it than that. Can you give a brief outline of what she said? And also, when you use the phrase SGO, which I think you're going to possibly use the phrase SGO a couple of times in the next answer, could you explain to everyone what SGO actually means? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Well, I think we have to first of all recognise that the letter from the inspector is a preliminary letter. She will eventually produce a full report at the end of the local plan process, which will be quite some time away. So this is giving, if you like, advance warning of some of the important conclusions she's reached. She has actually given Eastleigh a way of achieving a sound plan. So you can have a plan which can be adopted, provided they agree to make some important changes, which are called modifications. And that includes the deletion of the strategic growth option, or the SGO, which is options B and C, plus the proposed new road. She did not find the case made for the SGO to be sound. She saw flaws in the evidence that was presented to her in the way in which they'd reached their conclusion. That's exactly what Add said. We said, look, they've done it the wrong way round. They should have looked at the evidence properly and then reached a conclusion. And it was quite clear that they decided in 2014-15 that they were going to do a development in the north of Eastleigh, and that was going to be the part of the plan that was going to go through regardless. Then they asked the planning officers to come up with the evidence to support a decision already made. And that is back to front, and the inspector clearly saw through that. And she criticised, in particular, a number of aspects. She said they hadn't taken account of how the development might intrude on the South Downs National Park. They hadn't considered the landscape issues properly. They had a policy on gaps which was not consistent, and so on. So she found a whole series of flaws, and that led her to reject the SGO. Ironically, she didn't get on to consider what we thought were some of the strongest arguments against the proposed SGO, which include the intrusion on the most valuable, environmentally valuable areas in the borough, the Itchen Special Area of Conservation. She didn't look at the issues of viability of the proposed SGO. She didn't need to, in one sense, because she found so many flaws early on. They were enough for her to reject the plan. But those other arguments are still there in the background, and if Eastleigh ever bring forward their proposal again, those arguments will still be valid.
So I just want to say one time to be very clear. When John refers to SGO, he's talking specifically about options B and C, and SGO stands for strategic growth options. So every time we say SGO, that means options B and C in this particular context. So Caroline, wearing your CPRE hat, how common is it for a planning inspector to criticise the local plan in just a letter? It's not even the full report, as much as this one.
Well, it's not unheard of, but it is rare. Most inspectors want to see a sound plan. You know, it's common sense that people want to see a plan-led process and development based on that plan. And so they will generally go as far as they can to see a plan soundly through the system, but not to the extent of letting something go through which is completely flawed, which is what she found in this case. As John mentioned, some of the words she used, significant concerns, fundamentally flawed, without justification. Those are words which you don't often see an inspector using. I mean, I said that earlier, it was an excoriating rebuttal of Eastleigh's proposals. And that is significant, because it's not common an inspector will go that far at this stage when a plan needs to be thrown out.
And now I've got our first question that we were sent before the webinar began, a question from Julie, who I'm thinking lives in Fair Oak, and it's one of a number addressing the same concern. So how can we be sure that planning applications aren't going to be approved in option B and C areas when there are no other plans in place? An example of this, she says, is the development at Pembers Hill Park of over 200 houses along Mortimer's Lane. In other words, could the council bring in parts of the local plan through the back door even, though the inspector has rejected them? Do you want to take that one, John?
Yeah, nothing is impossible, but if they were to start approving planning applications for developments in the SGO area, the option B and C area, they would first of all be running quite counter to what the inspector has said, because she made it quite clear that they have not justified development in that area. So they would immediately be countering what the inspector said. And they actually don't need to bring forward further development, because they have an adequate housing supply, sufficient for the next 6 years. And indeed, the developments that are already in the plan, which the inspector has accepted, will take them through to the early 2030s before they require yet more housing to meet their eventual target set by the government through to 2036 on the current basis. So they don't need to be giving planning consent for major developments in the options B, C area or anywhere else for that matter. But if they do go ahead and try and approve development in option B and C, they've got several problems. I mean, first of all, the South Downs National Park proximity, if they were, for instance, to bring forward development on the East Horton Golf Course, that is the closest area to the South Downs National Park, which the inspector has highlighted is very, very sensitive, and any traffic generated from the development would have an adverse impact on the national park. They've also got the major problem that without the so-called link road, they haven't got anything to offer to deal with the additional traffic that development in the option C area would generate. And Keith House has frequently pointed out that the main road running through from Fair Oak to Eastleigh is the most congested road in the borough. And of course, the development of housing, large numbers of housing in the option C area, would add to that traffic congestion. It would also, incidentally, make it even more difficult for them to ever bring forward options B and C in its totality. Because having granted development rights for some part of it, but without that development contributing towards the major infrastructure that's planned in the Eastleigh proposal for the SGO, they will lose the opportunity of getting a contribution towards what their plan is for the whole of options B and C in the new road. So, I mean, I think it doesn't make any sense, and I just don't think it'll happen.
I've just had a technical question through that I want to throw in because this is talking about the letter specifically. It's from Hugh and Chloe Petter. I thought the inspector's letter acknowledged that the council did not have a 5-year land supply.
No, that's not true. This was actually questioned quite closely, And the figure is certainly over 5 years. And it's according, there's some very detailed issues about how exactly you calculate particular sites. But it is between 5 and 6 years. But Caroline, you might like to comment on that. You're very up to date on the housing numbers.
Yes, the inspector agreed that they did have a sufficient 5-year housing land supply. And that was based on the current housing numbers which are in the plan. Going forward, we anticipate that it may be the case that the housing numbers in any future plan would actually be significantly less for Eastleigh than the ones they're carrying at the moment. The population predictions for Eastleigh in 2036 are some 7,000 people lower than those that the Eastleigh Borough Council are using in their current local plan. So on average, that's about 2,500 to 3,000 houses that would be not required that they thought might be required at the end of the plan period. So not only do they have a current 5-year housing land supply, but looking forward, their housing needs should be adequately met without the need for an SGO at all.
And then just one last question on the letter from Dermot, who asked this before this evening, is asking why the inspector is not acknowledging the environmental damage caused by B&C in the letter specifically.
Well, she may return to that issue in her final report, but as I said earlier, she found sufficient wrong with the process they'd followed for that to be enough for her to say the SGO is not justified. She didn't have to rehearse every single argument that might apply against the SGO. I mean, from our point of view, it was a bit of a surprise in one sense, because we thought the environmental intrusion, the potential damage to the Itchen SAC was the strongest argument of all against the proposal that Eastleigh were putting forward for the SGO. So we never got on to what we thought was the strongest case against it. But she may make some comments in her full report. We have to wait and see.
Brilliant.
And we are still waiting for some additional information from Natural England as well to put into. So that may influence what she subsequently writes in her final report.
And just one last, because it's sort of on the same subject, from Noel O'Dowd, who says, congratulations on the success. You delivered a great result for the people of Bishopstoke in particular. I may be a little paranoid, but is there any possibility this plan was a decoy, as the council quietly builds the houses it thinks it needs? So it's a similar question to the Pembers Hill question, but just I thought, is that a possibility?
Well, no, because having a local plan is fundamental to the whole planning process. The local authority is obliged to have a local plan. Eastleigh's last plan was actually rejected by the previous planning inspector as being unsound, largely to do with the issue of delivering sufficient affordable housing. And they have been without a plan, therefore, in the last few years. And of course, this means that there is no planning guidance for what happens. And you get a lot of planning application popping up all over the place, which is not something that is desirable under any circumstances. So a local authority must have a local plan, and the local plan has to guide what they then do. They can't simply then ignore it. So I think the answer to the question is no, they couldn't do that even if they wanted to. I mean, they can't have a local plan as a decoy and then just do something completely different, because it would be found to be illegal. They could be challenged on the grounds that they've not followed the proper planning procedure.
It's probably worth adding that Eastleigh were on a list of councils, a watch list for councils who had a long period without a local plan because the previous one was thrown out. So I suspect if they were sufficiently Machiavellian to have come up with this as a sort of attempt to get something through by the back door and then have it thrown out, then the government inspector, the inspectorate will step in because they've already been warned prior to this local plan.
One final question before we move on to our next theme is from Lisa Croce. When is the full report expected?
Well, we just don't know. I mean, the best guess I would have is at the end of this year. Obviously the coronavirus situation is going to impact on the rate at which the various stages can be completed. Before she writes her final report, the council has to agree with her a series of main modifications, in other words, amendments that will have to be made to the draft plan in order to allow her to find it sound. And these amendments, when they've been agreed, will go out to consultation. There is a 6 weeks period when everybody can comment, and obviously will look at those amendments or modifications very closely, and we'll put in our representations. She then has to consider those representations, along with any additional evidence studies that she may have asked for in order to help her to finalize her views on the local plan. And she's got to consider all that, and then she's got to write up her plan, her report. And then when she's done that, she presents it to the council, and the council then has to consider it and then formally pass a resolution to adopt the amended local plan. So I think the end of this year, or even into the beginning of next year, which will mean the whole campaign has gone on for about 5 years. Well,
so moving on to, time has flown, by the way, time has flown. Moving on, Eastleigh Borough Council's response. So when the inspector's letter came out, Council leader Keith House was quick to say, very quick to say, in fact, that the council could still go ahead with options B and C in the current version of the local plan. John, you've been exchanging emails with the council's chief executive since that moment, and the inspector's letter came out, and Eastleigh released a press statement saying that everything was fine. What exactly are they proposing? Because it's been mixed messages, really, hasn't it?
Well, I mean, I think many of us were completely, I think the expression would be gobsmacked when we saw the media release, because that came out on the same day as the inspector's letter. I should explain that local authorities get a few days grace, so they'd seen the inspector's letter, which is dated the 1st of April, a few days before the rest of us. So they had time to prepare their media release, which came out therefore on the same day as the inspector's letter. And you remember the words that were included in that were, she has not dismissed the council's proposed strategic growth option. She has not dismissed the council's proposed strategic growth option. Well, I mean, that's just exactly the opposite of what she said. She did dismiss it. So I took this up with the chief executive of Eastleigh Borough Council and said, look, we really shouldn't argue about points of fact. And you clearly have said something which is just not correct. And he did come back to me, and I'll read you what he said in his email. I'll read you the key bit. He said, she, i.e. the inspector, is not satisfied that we have demonstrated that the SGO is the most suitable site for major housing growth, and it is clear that we will not be able to include the SGO in this version of the local plan. So that's absolutely clear. But he goes on to say, it is very important to recognise that the inspector has not ruled out the current SGO as the site to provide additional housing in the future. It is right to say the SGO will not form part of the local plan, but it would be utterly misleading to say it has been dropped from any future review or plans. So there is the suggestion there that they might bring it forward when they review the current plan. And to explain, local authorities produce the local plan, and then not more than 5 years later, they have to review that plan and amend it and change it as necessary. And they have to do that again after another 5 years. That's a rolling process. Maximum of 5 years, but they don't have to wait as long as 5 years. They can do the review earlier. And the point that Eastleigh are making is that because the inspector has rejected the SGO, they're going to be short of 3,350 houses which are needed to meet their 2036 housing target. But as I said earlier, that shortfall is only evident when you get past 2030, 31. So
So
they don't have
just
to do something about it immediately.
can I just be very, very clear, John? The actual shortfall of the houses that Eastleigh Borough Council are supposed to build, according to the government numbers and push numbers and all of that, they're only by removing options B and C from the local plan. How much are they short by?
Well, their shortfall is 3,350 houses up to 2036. Now, just to avoid confusion, many of you will know that the target for options B and C is around 5,500. But the balance of the 5,500 above 3,350 would be built after 2036 through to 2044 in their original plan, the plan that's now been rejected.
Excellent. Now, I have a question that we had a couple of days ago from the wonderful Pam Glasspool from Colden Common. She would like to know if Add has been in contact with the inspector, and does the inspector know about the council's response to her letter?
Well, I should first of all explain that there is no direct contact with the planning inspector. In that regard, it's a bit like a court of law and a case going through a court. You can't write to the judge about something that you're concerned about. So all of the communication is done via the program officer, and the inspector, it has very, very strict rules or framework against which he or she can consider anything that is being submitted. So you can't simply have an ongoing dialogue with the planning inspector. But the exchange that I had with the Nick Tustian, the chief executive, and indeed the other exchanges, the MP for Eastleigh, Paul Holmes, also wrote to Keith House, the leader, making many of the same points, that the media release was very misleading, to say the least. Those were copied to the program officer. So they are available.
So she does know. She probably does know.
We can't say whether she has read them or not. I mean, officially she's not there to take account of anything like that, but it's available to her.
Okay, that's good to know. Now, Caroline, we have an anonymous question that was posed just before we went live, is whether Councillor House can appeal the verdict and even take it to judicial review.
Not as far as I'm aware. The planning inspectorate is, he would have to go to the High Court, and I think the grounds that he would have to go on would be extremely limited, because she has very thoroughly looked at the evidence. That's her job, and not least, it's the evidence that she's looked at has been agreed by our legal team, or AD's legal team, and an enormous range of experienced and expert people that are charities in their own right, and experts that AD has paid for to look at the case. So were he to try and challenge it, I think he would be on very thin ice. I can't see that happening at all. It would be a very strange modus operandi to try and challenge a planning inspector who had said had based it all on evidence that she had put in front of her.
Brilliant.
And I would just add to that, the planning inspectorate, they have their own legal advisors, and they are extremely careful about following proper process. They do not want to be challenged if at all possible. And of course, the challenge normally comes from objectors who don't like the outcome. It doesn't come from the local authority. So you might get a developer, for instance, who hoped to get a proposal through the local plan and failed, and then that developer will challenge the inspector. So they are very, very careful about following the process rigorously.
Yeah, I think it would have to be, they would have to try and challenge it on some evidence that she hadn't followed proper procedure, whereas ironically her letter actually says that's what they themselves haven't done.
Indeed. So I've got one question, which is from the Q&A from Anne Bowden or Bowden. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. Is it time for Keith House to resign, since he's failed yet again to produce a local plan to protect our environment? Caroline, do you want to take that first?
Well, CPRE is a completely apolitical charity. We have no axe to grind as to who's in charge at any local council. That's for the local electorate to decide. All we do is look at the evidence. Has it been based on detailed, correct evidence? Has it gone through proper procedure? In our case, particularly, we look at the landscape and the countryside aspects. And that, so Keith House and his position is of actually no relevance to either us or to the inspector.
And John?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, we too are apolitical. It's not for us to say who the leader of Eastleigh should be. I mean, that is a decision for the ruling group. I mean, the Lib Democrats hold the majority, the significant majority in Eastleigh, and they decide who their leader is. And for over 25 years, they've expressed their confidence in Keith House. I mean, that is a fact.
So in terms of the BC area, just moving on a little bit from the council's reaction to what the council could do. So if the council does reintroduce options B and C in 5 years or earlier than 5 years, which is what they have indicated, perhaps in a modified form and maybe with the proper research, would it have to go through the same public examination as the local plan has? Caroline?
Yes, it would. Any local plan has to go through the same process. So they would have to start again with what's called the Regulation 18 consultation, which normally takes the shape of an issues and options document, which is what they did back in December 2015 or thereabouts. They would then have to come up with a preferred option. Their statement of community involvement says that they themselves will consult upon that. And then they have to come up with a preferred option, having gone through properly this time all of the evidence. Now, we are firmly of the opinion that if they had properly gone through all of the evidence, they wouldn't in their wildest dreams have put options B and C on the table as the preferred option, because the evidence points so far against that as being the option of choice. And all of those factors have been confirmed by the inspector. They can't suddenly take away the fact there's a national park there and that the traffic will have adverse impacts upon it. They can't take away the fact that this is at the furthest from any sustainable point of transport. To add to that, not least, there's climate change, which they didn't really cover because it wasn't really high at top of the agenda when they did their local plan, but it is now. So all of those factors can't disappear suddenly when they come up with a revised local plan, which they will do at some point in the future. But it will take several years to go through that process, and we will have to decide at the Cherry to consult upon it.
And just as a very relevant question from Hugh and Chloe Petter again, which is just a really obvious but fundamental question, which is why do you think Eastleigh are so keen on options B and C? John?
Well, I think a lot of people have scratched their heads and tried to make sense of it, because as Caroline was saying, on any objective grounds, it really is the least suitable place to put major development. It's the most pristine part of the whole of the borough of Eastleigh. It was declared a biodiversity priority area by Eastleigh itself in 2001. Why would you put a development there? Why would you put it so far from the main centre of Eastleigh, from the rail system and so on and so on? And I think the only conclusion one can reach is that they're doing what a number of local authorities have done, which is to try and reduce the potential unpopularity of a major housing development by putting it right on the boundary. If you put it right on the boundary of your local authority with a neighbouring local authority, in this case Winchester, then half the people that potentially are going to get very upset are not your voters. And I mean, you can't think of another reason why they could do it. I mean, it just does not make any sense from any other point of view. And I think, going back to what Caroline was saying, if they bring it forward in the review of the local plan, they'll have to go through the process properly, because the planning inspector that looks at the review plan will, of course, he or she is not obliged to follow what Inspector Masters has said, but they will look at it and take significant note of what the previous inspector said. And all the same challenges will be there facing them if they try and bring it forward again. And I'd add one other point to what Caroline said. We have, of course, the uncertainty of the coronavirus pandemic. We don't know what that's going to do in terms of the demand for housing, whether it's going to severely affect the economy in the medium to longer term, which is quite possible. And indeed, it may lessen the enthusiasm of developers for undertaking really large schemes. And option B and C in the new road is a huge scheme. It's 5,500 houses. The gross cost of the scheme is £1.5 billion, and it's set to be delivered over 25 years. Now, are developers really going to be in the mood to take on that kind of risk? Or will they look for something that is rather shorter term and smaller in scale? So there are many, many unknowns. Added to, I'd repeat the point about the climate change challenge. Eastleigh says it intends to be carbon neutral by 2030. 2030, that's 10 years away. And we're talking about a review of their plan. And one of the important issues is, of course, what they do about transport and about reducing car usage.
And I think just reflecting on what you're saying as well about it being on the edge of the borough, I think it is just worth noting of the fact that it's the parishes within Eastleigh and outside of Eastleigh that have come together to form AD and the supporters. So it's everyone on, in the Bishopstoke Fair Oak area, the Albrook area, the Boyett Wood area, but also on the other side, so Coldham Common, Upham, Osselbury, Twyford, Otterbourne. It really has been a coming together of people to support AD, and that I think we'd just like again to say thank you. And as John quite rightly pointed out, it has been going on for some time now. It does take up, it's taken up many, many years now, and I think it looks as though we're going to be continuing, doesn't it, John? So will AD still be at the table in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time when this is revisited?
Oh, golly. I fear we may be. I mean, I think we all hope that, you know, after 4 years, we could, as it were, put the papers aside and get on with something else. But it's rather depressing to think that we may have to go on battling. And I would just add, you see, that we are not against building housing in Eastleigh. We know that that housing is required. But what we've constantly said is it should be the right kind of housing in the right location. And the demand is, for instance, for starter homes. The demand is for housing for the elderly. But what the developers, of course, find most profitable to build is 4, 3, 4, 5 bedroom executive homes. And they are being planned in locations which are very remote from public transport. And they're certainly at a price which starter homes just doesn't come into the picture. If you look at the Crowd Hill development, you know, a 3-bedroom house is £400,000, a 4-bedroom house, £500,000. So, you know, we don't think it's the right kind of housing in the right location. We certainly support Eastleigh meeting the housing needs of local people, but doing it in a sensible way, putting it in the most sustainable locations.
And I think that moves on to our next theme, as it were. So well done, John. Good link. Thank you. And theme 3 is really, are we being NIMBYs? You know, not in my backyard. And actually, you know, absolutely, people can quite rightly throw that accusation at us, because it is in our backyard, but it's a backyard that we care about, and the environment and the amazing ecology in this area. So I want to ask Caroline, what is your ideal development in your eyes?
Well, I think first of all, it's something that's often thrown at CPRE, that we're all a bunch of NIMBYs. And my answer to that is, well, first of all, it depends what your backyard is. And if you're worried about the whole of Hampshire and where best to put housing in Hampshire, or even worried about the whole of England and where best to put housing in England, then it changes your perspective. And so from a completely objective point of view, because I don't live in Eastleigh, I don't even live in the bit of Winchester near to Eastleigh, I look at the whole of South Hampshire, and in fact the whole of Hampshire, and try and work out where best housing should be for the people that need it in the most sustainable and climate friendly fashion. And so this is really comes back to, if you look at things with a level playing field and you look at them in terms of what makes a sustainable development, you wouldn't be starting from here if you ended up with, you know, options B and C. So I don't think anybody who cares about their environment should be considered a NIMBY. I think most people who are involved in any sort of environmental aspects of trying to work out how to make their environment better should look at it, should be considered to be an ally for local councils, because that's what local councils are about. It's about making good places for people to live.
And further on that theme, AD has a wide range of planning and other relevant expertise. Caroline is a really good example of that. And the AD committee in particular, and the AD supporters, the wider group, really are a smart bunch of people. And we've repeatedly offered to work with the council to help seek a sustainable solution to Eastleigh's housing needs. So, John, what responses have we had?
Well, I referred to this earlier. I mean, sadly, we haven't. You know, we did have meetings with the planning officers early on, and we put points to them, but there was really no evidence that they were taking account of those points. We just got the feeling that they had already been told what the answer was, and they had to produce the evidence to support that. We talked about the SGO, what that means. Actually, Eastleigh itself coined the term strategic growth option. And it said back in 2016, in order to deliver the housing we require, we're going to have one major development, which they characterized as being perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 houses, in addition to the smaller sites across the whole borough. And they actually created two alternatives. This wasn't AD or anybody else, it was Eastleigh that did it. And BC was one, and DE was the other. DE is essentially in Allington Lane. And they were supposed to have looked at the two on an equal basis and concluded which delivered the most evidence-based solution that actually said this is the right place to put the housing. And they just didn't do the job properly because they already had the answer. It's got to be BC. Now, we argued throughout that you should make your plan evidence-based. And if it turned out that the evidence showed that options B, C was truly the right place to put the housing, we'd have to accept the logic of that. But they didn't do that. They didn't do the job properly. And of course, they'll have to return to that. They'll have to look at other options such as DE. The inspector has also told them to look at the potential for housing on the Hamble Peninsula, which they simply rejected without doing a proper study. So they've got quite a lot of work to do to come up with a proper evidence-based solution, which is sustainable. And, you know, when they do that, we'll support that.
And I've just had a question in from Ian Mitchell, which is a great question. How can AD encourage or ensure that some of the more sustainable and environmentally friendly ideas that were suggested during the process are followed up?
Well, thanks, Ian, for that tough question. I mean, we will go on, you know, trying to persuade Eastleigh to do the right thing. And, you know, to give an example of that, I mean, we did a lot of work to look at what the rail options might be. What could you do to improve the rail service serving the borough? And there's quite a lot of evidence. We had meetings with Network Rail, we've talked to the Three Rivers Rail Partnership, and we'll go on doing that kind of thing. We'll go on stimulating a discussion and suggesting ways in which Eastleigh could find other ways to deliver what it wants. In terms of the rail options, I'm afraid they didn't do a proper job. They just dismissed it rather peremptorily. And that was again on the back of the fact they'd already decided they wanted B and C. The one option where there's no hope of having a rail connection which could help serve that new community.
And interestingly, just today, I noticed there's a process of bidding out for funding from the government for new stations, and it would be up to Eastleigh Borough Council to apply for that new funding should they so wish. It's called New Station Fund 3, I think, and as far as I'm aware, they haven't applied. I in jest said perhaps Add should apply itself to put a new station in, but that might be
we appear to be able to move mountains, Caroline, so I suggest it's something we consider. Now, I just want to thank everyone for sticking with us. We're not over yet. We've got a little bit of way to go, and that is in terms of the webinar and the campaign. I've got a list of who's watching, and there are literally hundreds of you, so we really do appreciate it. And I just thought it was worth reading a lovely comment from Kathy O'Neill, who's just said, "This virtual meeting is a terrific way to let supporters know what is happening. Post-coronavirus, can this type of meeting continue, please?" Well, as long as they don't cut you all off or work out how to do something crazy with this Zoom, I'm sure we can make that happen, and hopefully we'll see each other in person as well as virtually in the not too distant future. So going to move on now to the next section, which is what is next. What are the next few years of our lives going to look like from the Add committee point of view is how I interpret that. So what are the next stages, Caroline? Could you just talk through logistically? So we've got this letter, which is the planning inspector's initial report, as it were, or initial findings in a letter, and then there will be the report. So what happens then?
Well, the inspector has in her letter to date suggested some considerable changes which Eastleigh need to accept for their local plan to be found sound. So we assume from the communication that John has had with Nick Testian that they will accept what she has requested that they do. The most important and significant of which is to delete the policies which include options B and C and the link road from their plan. They will then move to a document called main modifications, which John referred to earlier, and that we will also have a chance then to be consulted upon their main modifications. So we will see a draft of a local plan which does not include options B and C. And that will come out sometime, depending on obviously the significant constraints that everybody's under at the moment, sometime later in the year. That will go to us for consultation, and it will also go to the inspector. And after that, we hope that Eastleigh will be able to adopt a local plan which will be considered sound and will not include options B and C. So that's the most significant thing that will happen over the next 8 to 12 months, that we will still have work to do to check that the main modifications haven't veered considerably from what she has suggested, and that they then do go on and adopt it. I suspect at that stage everybody will pause for thought, and then Eastleigh will probably start almost immediately reviewing the local plan for the next stage, for the next 5 years of their plan. And if at that point, I really hope that Add is still together and willing to continue looking at the plan going forward. It's a long haul. I know I've been looking at planning in Southampton as a volunteer, in South Hampshire as a volunteer for the last 15 years. So I'm obviously a sucker for punishment, but I'm rather hoping that other people can join me in the cause.
Do you know how much I know about planning? I really am not a planning expert at all. I'm a media expert. I now know what an SGO means and other abbreviations. It's quite a tunnel to go down once you get started. So in terms of timescale, could you just sort of, in a brief couple of sentences, John, give us the sort of the timescale of the next stages?
Well, as I say, I think it's going to take till the end of this year or maybe just into next year for the current plan to be finalized and moved to the point where it's an adopted plan. Now, I think there are so many questions facing Eastleigh, I mean, not least climate change, post-coronavirus and so on. As I said earlier, I think it would be really remiss of them to simply steamroller ahead and say, we've now got to get on with our review and do an early. They don't have to do an early review. The inspector didn't require them to do an early review. I mean, she noted they had enough housing through to the early part of 2030-31, and there is no great urgency on their part. So I think with all these other big challenging questions, I hope they'll pause and think about what they've got to do about climate change, and then actually start on a rather different direction, rather than going back over the same old ground and saying, we've got to have an SGO, we've got to find the right SGO, which in our view is going to be B and C, but this time we're going to have to do the evidence gathering properly and do the comparison properly, but we'll hope to end up with the same solution. That to me is old thinking. The current plan was thought about, first gestated back in 2014-15. So much has changed since then. They ought to start afresh and think in a different way. Now, if they do that, then of course the thing will go on for quite some years to come, but we'll have to see.
Now, we've had a question from a David Haxton, which I don't know the answer to. What happens if the next local plan, so I suppose that could either be the revised local plan without options B and C, or another one in 5 years' time. What happens if the next local plan is also rejected? At what point does someone have to overrule the council?
Well, sorry, just to make sure that we're on the same page, I said earlier on, if Eastleigh accept the modifications, the amendments that the inspector requires, they have a route to getting an adopted plan. So it won't be rejected, it'll be accepted. It would only be rejected if they refused to accept the modifications that the inspector requires. So the question is, I think, starting on a false premise. I mean, a local authority, if it has its plan rejected twice in a row, it really is in some difficulty. And that's one of the reasons why I think Eastleigh has no option but to accept the modifications the inspector requires. If this plan was rejected, following the last plan having been rejected, then there would undoubtedly be intervention from Whitehall. It's possible that another authority or party would be appointed to draw up a plan for Eastleigh. I mean, the Secretary of State, for instance, could ask Hampshire County Council to take over the preparation of a plan for Eastleigh. Well, that would be hardly something that I think the Eastleigh leadership would welcome. So I think they will accept the amendments and they will seek to have an adopted local plan.
So we've come incredibly far, from marching through Stoke Park Woods to singing outside the hotel at the Rose Bowl. That was a particular favourite of mine, standing outside the council meeting, to dressing up as trees. Now, I don't know if you can see this. I was tidying my daughter's bedroom earlier and I found my tree crown, well, my daughter's tree crown. That was a particular highlight of the ad campaign, was dressing up as trees. And we've even been demonstrating the massive demonstration outside of the inquiry, which I think lots of people turned up to. So we really have come a long way, and it's taken a long time, and the supporters have been there. And as I think Caroline and John have established, the fight isn't over, and we still need to be vigilant, and Add will be at the table at the next stage. So I suppose the next question is, what can people do to help? What do we do now as the supporters?
Well, I think it's difficult to say precisely because we don't know exactly what's going to happen, as we've discussed over the past hour or so. There are several different scenarios, but I would make the first point that AD supporters are both within, they live within the borough of Eastleigh, and they live outside it. And the supporters of AD that live within Eastleigh, bluntly, will be listened to more closely by the councillors in Eastleigh because they are electors. And councils are always sensitive to what their electorate thinks. They find it rather easier to ignore people that are not their electorate. So I think, first of all, those who live within Eastleigh need to carry on lobbying their members, their local councillors, the leader, simply to say, look, we want to see a sensible, sustainable local plan, which is evidence-based. The same arguments apply to those living outside Eastleigh, but they won't be listened to so directly or carefully as those within Eastleigh. But I think all of us should use the opportunities we have, the links we've got, to simply say local planning should be evidence-based, and in the case of the Eastleigh plan, it should be one that is sustainable and doesn't actually destroy the finest countryside remaining in the borough. And if, you know, wherever you have a chance to make that point, please do make it. I mean, from the point of view of the ad campaign, we will seek direct help as and when we need it. I mean, if we ask you to engage in letter writing or to attend for a particular purpose, you know, to show your feelings, or indeed, you know, to help us in any way by giving advice, delivering leaflets, or indeed giving us money to support the campaign, we'll do that at the right moment.
So
And can I add? Yeah.
I just want to know if I can dress up as a tree again anytime soon. That's my main question of the night. No, I'm sorry, Caroline, carry on.
I was just saying that there is something positive that CPRE are embarking on or have been embarking on, and perhaps that's something that people can do while we're, if you like, waiting for the next stage. We have for a couple of years been campaigning for a new green belt for South Hampshire, and the area in options B and C is a critical, integral part of what could be a new green belt to protect the open spaces around Portsmouth and Southampton and the older urban areas of sort of Eastleigh. And now that the inspector, we were sort of caught in limbo waiting to see what the inspector would say, but now she's come out with her letter. We feel that we are vindicated in our belief that this is an area which should be protected in perpetuity, and that we are going to campaign for it to become a green belt. That's not just green fields. Green belt is a planning term, which means that it is kept as open space for the future. And so anybody who wants to join in our CPRE campaign for a new green belt, we had a petition that got nearly 14,000 signatures a year or so ago, and we're going to raise that petition again. So that's something that perhaps we can do in the short term and is a positive way forward to try and encourage local councillors to get on board and support the cause as well.
And I think just from an ad point of view as well, John, I'm sure you'd agree that we'd like to thank our supporters in every way they've helped, but also financially, because it's the financial contribution of the supporters that have paid for the experts that we have used to fight this campaign, and the barrister in particular. You know, Eastleigh Borough Council spent £3 million, is that correct, John? On the local...
Yeah, I mean, their budget for the local plan is 3 million, and you know, they have engaged consultants galore. They had a QC and a junior present throughout the local plan examination, and it is a bit like David and Goliath, as I said earlier on. I mean, I can tell you that we did extremely well in terms of our fundraising, and we spent just over £160,000 on fighting the local plan from the time of the beginning of the campaign in the early 2016. And that is a tremendous amount of money to have raised from our supporters. But you can see against 3 million, it looks pretty paltry, but I would say that the return on the money we spent looks rather better than the return on the 3 million that Eastleigh has committed.
So
but we will potentially need to ask you for further support. And I don't have any apology about doing that, because it is absolutely vital. The success we had in fighting the plan was because we were able to do it in a very professional way, drawing on the advice of the consultants, planning, ecology, transport, and so on, and our barristers. And without that, you just can't make a proper case. You really have to do it professionally. Because on the other side, you've got professionals who spend all their life doing planning, and you know, they engage consultants and so on, and you have huge reports to manage, and you've got to actually get to the nub of the issue. You've got to challenge things in a way that will be picked up by a planning inspector, and he or she will say, yeah, these people have got a point. They really are finding a flaw in what's going on here. And that was the key to our success. Along with, of course, you know, there was clearly a groundswell of support. You know, people were very angry. And I'm just so pleased for those people who helped us over those years, because it's very, very gratifying to have contributed money, to have spent time, to have delivered leaflets, and then to have a result. Great, great news.
And it's very, you know, clearly we are the David and in the David and Goliath story, but it's very important to say that we have won the battle, but not the war, that this is a great result, but we still need to keep going. Now, I've had several questions in that I haven't had time to ask, I'm afraid, and thank you very much to everyone who's asked them. Some of them are just have been very specific about specific areas. We've had a few questions about Horton Heath and the planning applications happening there specifically, and some other areas. But what we'll aim to do is take those questions and email you direct answers. But if you do have any other further questions you haven't managed to ask tonight, please contact us via the Facebook page or the support@add email address on our website. We're really keen to hear from you and to show you what Add's been doing, really, I think. And this is the reason that we wanted to do it in a time like this, when we have such great news, but it's such a difficult and unusual time for everyone, and not to be able to meet in person and say thank you personally. This is why we've done the webinar. But it's great to hear that it's been useful. So finally, I want to thank John and Caroline for taking part and explaining so clearly what's happened and what's going to happen. Do keep in touch with us. Thank you for everything, and please do stay safe in these times. And I look forward to meeting you all in person again and dressing as a tree. So thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yep, bye.